I'm going to Europe for 2 weeks with Sarah. Don't be dramatic, Lindsay. It's just a trip. The words hung in the air, colder than the chilled Chardonnay Eric was sipping. He didn't even look up from his phone. In that moment, 38 years of my life and 5 years of building a future with this man didn't just shatter. They turned into a razor-sharp clarity I had never felt before. To Eric, I wasn't his fiancé. I was a piece of furniture he expected to stay put while he went to rediscover soulmate energy with the woman he claimed was his past. Don't make a scene. He added a smirk playing on his lips as if he'd already won. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. As a licensed therapist, I recognized a predator's move when I saw one. So I did the one thing he never expected. I smiled. I kissed his cheek. I even helped him pack his silk shirts, wishing him a safe flight with a warmth that should have terrified him. But while Eric was dreaming of Parisian nights and old flames, I was in my home office dismantling his life brick by brick. You see, Eric made one fatal mistake. He thought I was his safety net. He didn't realize I was actually the only thing keeping his entire fraudulent empire from collapsing into a pile of legal ash. The moment his plane touched the tarmac in London, Eric's vacation ended and his nightmare began. Stay with me because what I did next involves a secret alliance, a financial trap he set for himself, and a legal ambush that left him stranded and penniless before he even cleared customs. You won't want to miss the moment the hunter realized he was the one in the cage. My name is Lindsay, and at 38, I have spent the better part of a decade as a licensed marriage and family therapist helping people navigate the wreckage of their own hearts. I have made a career out of identifying the subtle fractures in a relationship before they become catastrophic breaks, but as the old saying goes, the cobbler's children often go barefoot. I had spent 5 years convinced that Eric was the exception to every cynical rule I knew, believing our upcoming wedding was the finish line of a long-earned journey toward stability. The dinner started like any other Tuesday. The roast chicken was perfectly seasoned, the candles were flickering, and the domestic quiet felt like a sanctuary. But looking back, I realized the silence wasn't peace. It was the heavy, breathless air before a storm. Eric reached for the bottle of Cabernet, his movements fluid and rehearsed. He didn't look at me as he poured. His eyes were fixed on the deep red swirl in his glass, a telltale sign that he was mentally inhabiting a space where I didn't exist. "I've booked the flights, Lindsay," he said, his voice as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "I'm going to Europe for 3 weeks with Sarah. It's a spiritual necessity at this point. I need to reconnect with a version of myself that only she truly understands. And please," he added, finally lifting his eyes to meet mine with a gaze that was surgically cold, "don't be dramatic. We're adults. I shouldn't have to explain why I need this." The air in the room seemed to vanish. In the world of therapy, we call this a pattern of dominance. He wasn't asking for my thoughts, nor was he seeking a compromise. He was issuing a decree, a royal proclamation delivered across a dinner table that I had polished with my own hands. By labeling any potential reaction of mine as dramatic, before I had even opened my mouth, he was effectively gagging me. It was a classic move of minimization, a preemptive strike designed to make me feel small, hysterical, and irrational for having a heartbeat, let alone a boundary. In that moment, something shifted deep inside my psyche. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The woman who loved Eric, the woman who had spent years making excuses for his artistic temperament and his need for space, stepped back into the shadows. In her place stood the therapist. I felt my heart rate stabilize, my breathing become rhythmic and shallow. I wasn't an injured fiancé anymore. I was a clinical observer, watching a fascinatingly flawed specimen reveal his true nature. I watched the way his jaw tightened, the entitlement radiating from his posture. He sat there with his shoulders broad, claiming the space in our home as if it were his birthright. I noted the lack of empathy in his tone, the way he skipped entirely over the fact that we were supposed to be planning our wedding, not his getaway with an ex-girlfriend. To him, I was an accessory to his life, a stable backdrop that was supposed to remain motionless while he played out his fantasies. He expected me to maintain the social decorum he had cultivated to be the cool, understanding wife-to-be, who wouldn't make a scene that might embarrass him. So I gave him exactly what he wanted. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my wine. I simply nodded slowly, my eyes tracing the lines of his face as if I were memorizing a case study for a future lecture. "I see," I said softly. "You feel this is necessary for your personal growth." The effect was instantaneous. Seeing no resistance, Eric's entire demeanor transformed. The coldness evaporated, replaced by a boisterous, almost manic joviality. He laughed, a sound that used to warm me, but now sounded like dry leaves skittering on a grave. He began to talk about the itinerary, the villas in Tuscany, the hidden cafes in Montmartre, becoming increasingly kind and attentive as he felt the thrill of total victory. He even reached across the table to pat my hand, a gesture so patronizing it nearly made me recoil, but I remained still. He spent the rest of the evening being the most charming version of himself, unaware that I was mentally cataloging the expiration date of our life together. He chatted about the soulmate energy he hoped to recapture, completely oblivious to the fact that every word he spoke was another nail in the coffin of my respect for him. He felt safe. He felt powerful. He truly believed he had successfully managed me as if I were a difficult patient he had finally sedated. As I watched him pour a second glass of wine, celebrating his successful manipulation, I realized that his greatest weakness was his own arrogance. He was so convinced of his intellectual superiority that he couldn't imagine a world where I wasn't just accepting his terms, but preparing my own. He thought he had silenced me with a single command. He didn't realize that a therapist's silence is never empty. It is the most dangerous weapon in the room. He thought my silence meant permission. What it really meant was that I was done negotiating. The following morning, the sun bled through the curtains of our bedroom with an intrusive brightness that felt entirely at odds with the cold, clinical clarity settled in my chest. Eric was already up humming a tune as he rifled through his closet, pulling out linen trousers and expensive loafers for a climate he hadn't yet reached. I watched him from the pillows, my mind drifting to the countless women who had sat on the velvet sofa in my office over the years. Many of them were in their 60s and 70s, women with silver hair and hands that shook as they described decades of making it work. They spoke of the quiet erasures of their own desires, the way they had shrunk themselves to fit into the narrow margins of their husbands' egos just to keep the peace. I used to wonder how such intelligent, vibrant women could allow themselves to be hollowed out by a partner's indifference. Now, looking at the man I had intended to marry, I realized that the peace we were all so desperate to keep was actually a slow-motion surrender. We stay because we hope the person we fell in love with is still in there somewhere, buried under the layers of selfishness. We stay because we fear that leaving is a failure of our own character, rather than a response to theirs. But as I watched Eric meticulously fold a shirt, I understood that the decision to leave a man like him cannot be a frantic emotional outburst. It cannot be born of a midnight argument or a tearful plea for him to see my worth. It has to be surgical. It has to be an act of cold, calculated logic that prioritizes my survival over his comfort. I spent that day treating my life as the most important case study of my career. In the safety of my professional mind, Eric was no longer my fiancé. He was a textbook example of main character syndrome. A person who viewed everyone else in his life as a supporting actor whose only purpose was to advance his own narrative. His trip to Europe wasn't about Sarah, not really. It was about his insatiable need for narcissistic supply, the constant validation that he was desirable, adventurous, and unbound by the mundane rules of commitment. He relied on my emotional labor to maintain the household, to manage his social calendar, and to provide the stable foundation that allowed him to drift away whenever he felt bored. He was testing my boundaries with the precision of a scientist pushing to see just how much disrespect I would swallow before the mask of the perfect therapist slipped. He wanted to see if I would fulfill the role he had written for me, the long-suffering, dignified woman who would wait at home while he chased ghosts in Paris. By labeling his behavior, by stripping away the romantic excuses I had once made for him, I was able to detach myself from the searing pain of his betrayal. This wasn't about my inadequacy as a partner. It was about his pathology as a human being. Heartbreak is a chaotic, messy emotion, but self-preservation is a project, and I have always been excellent at my work. By noon, I had made a pivotal internal vow that changed everything. I would no longer explain myself to a man who was intentionally committed to misunderstanding me. For years, I had believed that if I could just find the right words, the right psychological framing, or the right moment of vulnerability, Eric would finally get it. I thought I could educate him into empathy, but standing in the kitchen as he prattled on about the architecture of Prague, I realized that his lack of understanding wasn't a communication failure, it was a weapon. He understood perfectly, he just didn't care. With that realization, a massive weight lifted off my shoulders. I didn't need him to agree that he was being cruel. I didn't need him to apologize for his entitlement. I only needed to protect myself. While he was busy curating his travel playlist, I began the silent, grueling work of disentangling my existence from his. I sat in my home office with the door locked, systematically gathering every password to our shared digital life. I scanned our premarital agreements, my eyes scanning the fine print with a focus I hadn't possessed when I signed them. I looked at our joint accounts, our property deeds, and the various business papers he had asked me to co-sign over the last year. I moved with a quiet, ghost-like efficiency fueled by a newfound sense of purpose. I was no longer striving to be respected by a man who was incapable of the act. I was ensuring that when the dust settled, I would be the one standing on solid ground. Eric mistook my focused quiet for a lingering sadness, occasionally offering a fleeting, condescending pat on the shoulder as he walked past me. "I'm glad you're being so mature about this, Lynn," he said, using the nickname that used to make my heart flutter, but now sounded like nails on a chalkboard. "It proves I made the right choice in you. You're so much more grounded than Sarah ever was." He didn't see the way my eyes followed him, not with longing, but with the cold calculation of an architect looking at a building slated for demolition. He was so blinded by his own perceived victory that he didn't notice the subtle shift in the air. He didn't notice that the woman who used to ask for his opinion on everything had stopped asking altogether. He didn't notice that his safety net was weaving itself into a shroud. Every shirt he packed was a step closer to a destination he hadn't planned for. As he closed his suitcase with a satisfied click, he looked at me and smiled, truly believing he had managed to have his cake and eat it too. He was headed for the romantic streets of Europe, leaving behind what he thought was a broken, submissive woman who would be waiting to pick up the pieces when he returned. He was so wrong. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my standards and his risk. The satisfied click of Eric's suitcase latched into place. A sound that should have signaled the beginning of his adventure, but in the silence of our shared home, it sounded like a gavel coming down. As he busied himself with a final check of his passport and travel humidor, his vanity was on full display, a man obsessed with the optics of his own success. I retreated to the mahogany desk in my study, a space he rarely entered because he found my work too heavy for his aesthetic tastes. I pulled up our joint venture portfolio, my fingers trembling only slightly as I began to look beneath the surface of the lifestyle he had so carefully curated for us. What I found was a betrayal that went far deeper than the infidelity of the heart. For years, Eric had described his business expansions as visionary, but the ledger told a more desperate story. I discovered that he had systematically used my impeccable credit score and my hard-earned personal assets, the very foundation of my future and my eventual retirement, as the primary collateral for a series of high-stakes failing commercial loans. He hadn't just been looking for a wife in me. He had been searching for a financial safety net that would allow him to gamble with abandon. While he was dreaming of the cobblestone streets of Europe with Sarah, he was leaning entirely on the weight of my sweat and tears to keep his fraudulent house of cards from toppling. He wasn't pursuing a spiritual necessity. He was taking a victory lap on my dime, leaving me to hold the bag for his reckless arrogance. The deeper I dug into the digital archives, the more the cold chill in my veins turned into a searing, righteous heat. I stumbled upon a file titled Administrative Finalized and opened a scanned PDF of a general power of attorney. My breath hitched in my throat. There at the bottom of the page was my signature. At first glance, it looked like mine, but the slant was too sharp, the loop on the L too tight. It was a forgery or perhaps a document he had slipped into a pile of mundane insurance forms during one of my busiest weeks at the clinic, banking on my trust to bypass my scrutiny. This document gave him the authority to sign for me to bind me to debts I never agreed to, and to leverage my reputation to pacify his restless creditors. This was no longer just a story of a man having a midlife crisis. This was a white-collar ambush. The injustice of it was staggering. I thought of the long hours I had spent listening to the traumas of others, the years I had spent carefully building a life of security, only to find that the man sleeping beside me had been treating my life's work like a disposable credit line. He had risked everything I owned to fuel his ego, and he had done it with the calculated precision of a predator who knew exactly how much I valued my stability. I realized then that if I confronted him now, he would simply pivot lie or worse, find a way to hide the remaining assets before I could move. In my line of work, I know that a cornered narcissist is at his most dangerous, so I chose the path of the strategic withdrawal. I waited until the house was silent, Eric having finally fallen into a peaceful, entitled sleep, and I began making the calls that would dismantle his world. I contacted my personal attorney and a forensic accountant I had recommended to clients in the past, men who understood that in a war of assets, speed and secrecy are the only allies that matter. Together, we began drafting a revocation of guarantee and a formal notification of the fraudulent power of attorney. I learned that Eric's entire business empire was essentially a parasitic organism that could only survive as long as it was attached to my financial health. His creditors only stayed at bay because they believed my assets were backing his every move. I was the invisible pillar holding up the roof of his vanity, and he was so blinded by his own reflection that he truly believed the roof was floating on its own. As the morning of his departure arrived, I watched him check his reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting his collar with a self-satisfied grin. He looked like a man who had everything: a successful business, a devoted fiancé waiting at home, and a beautiful ex-girlfriend waiting in London. He didn't see the woman standing in the shadows of the kitchen, the woman who had already signed the documents that would sever the tether between his debts and her life. I felt a strange, detached sense of wonder as I watched him walk toward the door with his luggage. He was so confident in his ownership of me, so certain that I was a permanent fixture of his landscape. He didn't understand that the moment he stepped onto that plane, he was stepping into a void of his own making. I had spent years protecting him, shielding him from the consequences of his own mediocrity, and translating his failures into unlucky breaks for our friends and family. But that version of me had died the moment I saw that forged signature. I stood by the window and watched his car pull out of the driveway, the taillights disappearing into the gray morning mist. He was headed toward his dream vacation, completely unaware that he had left the only person who could save him behind in the dust. I wasn't his partner. I was his protection, and I was about to step away. The silence that followed Eric's departure was not empty. It was the quiet, concentrated hum of a precision instrument being calibrated. I spent the next several hours in a state of flow that only those who have mastered a difficult craft can truly understand. Working in tandem with my attorney and the forensic accountant, I waited until the tracking app on my phone confirmed that Eric's flight had touched down at Heathrow. I knew his routine: the arrogant swagger through customs, the expensive car service to the Savoy, and the theatrical check-in where he would bask in the deference of the staff. I waited until I knew he was standing in that gilded lobby, probably with Sarah's hand tucked into the crook of his arm, before I gave the final signal to file the emergency injunction. The timing was a masterpiece of logistical sabotage. By filing on a Friday afternoon in the States, just as the business day was ending, I ensured that Eric would be met with frozen accounts and suspended credit lines at the exact moment he tried to settle into his luxury suite. He was now thousands of miles away, trapped in a different time zone where his bankers and lawyers were beyond his reach until the following Monday morning. I had effectively stranded him in a crisis of his own making, leaving him with nothing but his ego to pay for a vacation I was no longer willing to subsidize. It didn't take long for the digital storm to break. I sat in my quiet kitchen, a cup of tea cooling in front of me as my phone began to vibrate with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. Eric's name flashed across the screen over and over again. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end was unrecognizable. The smooth, condescending baritone had been replaced by a jagged, high-pitched desperation. He was stammering his words, tripping over each other as he demanded to know why his platinum card had been declined in front of the hotel manager and why his primary business account showed a restricted status. The confusion in his voice quickly curdled into a familiar defensive fury when I didn't immediately apologize. I took a slow breath, leaning back in my chair and adopting the calm, neutral tone I used when a patient was spiraling into a psychotic break. I didn't argue with him, and I certainly didn't raise my voice to match his crescendo of rage. I simply told him the truth in the most clinical way possible. I explained that I had discovered the irregularities in his filings and had retracted my financial backing and my signature from all joint ventures. I am no longer the guarantor of your risks, Eric. I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. You've spent years using my life as your collateral, but that credit line is now closed. You'll have to figure out the rest of your trip and your life on your own. The silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying sound I had heard in 5 years. For the first time, the main character had no script. He tried to pivot, attempting to use the old emotional levers of guilt and shared history, but I felt nothing but a detached interest in his struggle. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. While he was trapped in a hotel lobby, unable to even pay for a taxi, I was sitting in the home I had paid for and the life I had built, finally breathing air that wasn't heavy with his expectations. But the local collapse in London was only the beginning of the cascade. Because Eric had built his entire professional reputation on the illusion of my unwavering support, the removal of my guarantee triggered an automated domino effect back home. By Monday morning, his business partners began receiving alerts from the bank. The lenders who had tolerated his late payments only because of my credit standing were now calling in their markers. The carefully constructed mask of the visionary entrepreneur was dissolving in real time. I started receiving emails from his colleagues' men who had once looked down on my little therapy practice with barely veiled contempt, now asking me for clarification on Eric's liquidity. I didn't offer any. I simply referred them to my legal counsel. Watching his professional world begin to crumble from a distance was like watching a controlled demolition. It wasn't about malice. It was about the natural law of consequences. For years, I had been the one translating Eric to the world, smoothing over his social blunders and providing the silent dignity that made people trust him. Without me to interpret his actions or back his promises, he was just a middle-aged man with a suitcase full of linen shirts he couldn't afford to dry clean. The roles had reversed with a violent poetic justice. Eric was the one now pleading for a moment of my time, begging for an explanation, and desperately trying to negotiate a reality that was no longer up for discussion. I was the one in total control of the narrative, the one with the assets, and the only one who knew exactly how deep the hole he had dug for himself truly went. He had gone to Europe to find himself, and in a way I had helped him do. Just that he was finding out exactly who he was when he didn't have a woman to hide behind. The weight of his own choices was finally settling onto his shoulders, and the view from my side of the ocean had never been clearer. That was only the first envelope. The damage was already in motion. The days following Eric's departure were the quietest of my life, but they were also the most honest. In the silence of my home, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the truth I had been carrying for months. I knew about Sarah long before he announced that trip. I had seen the late-night notifications, the sudden expenditures for jewelry that never ended up around my neck, and the subtle, distracted glaze in his eyes when he looked at me. But as a therapist, I had decided to watch the pathology unfold rather than interrupt it. I realized that the trip to Europe wasn't a secret he was keeping. It was a psychological test he was conducting. Eric wasn't just choosing another woman. He was testing the limits of my usefulness. He wanted to see if he had successfully groomed me into a permanent doormat, a woman so terrified of losing the status of fiancé that she would tolerate an open betrayal in the name of maturity. He didn't want a partner. He wanted an unconditional hostage. By boarding that plane, he wasn't just chasing a romantic fantasy. He was confirming his belief that I would always be there to maintain his house, his reputation, and his secrets, no matter how much dirt he tracked in. He had failed the most basic test of human character, and in doing so, he had handed me the keys to his own destruction. But the most satisfying part of this clinical deconstruction was the alliance he never saw coming. 2 weeks before Eric left, I did something he considered impossible for a woman like me. I reached out to Sarah. I didn't call her to beg to scream or to play the victim. I approached her with the same professional detachment I would use to consult with a colleague on a difficult case. Sarah was 10 years younger than me, caught in the same whirlwind of soulmate rhetoric and grandiose promises that Eric had used to snare me years ago. She saw a wealthy visionary romantic who was misunderstood by his boring wife-to-be. I simply sent her a digital folder. I didn't include photos of us or sentimental pleas. I sent her a copy of Eric's true financial status, his stagnant business ledgers, and the list of the debts he had tried to tie to my name. I let her see that the wealthy romantic was actually a debt-ridden fraud who was using my credit score to buy her dinners. When the realization hit her that Eric wasn't a king, but a parasite looking for a new host, the soulmate connection evaporated. By the time they reached Paris, Sarah wasn't looking at him with adoration. She was looking at a man whose credit cards were being declined at the front desk of a hotel he couldn't afford. She didn't stay to help him navigate the crisis. She left him in that hotel lobby taking the return flight I had quietly suggested she keep as a backup. Eric was left truly alone in the city of lights, a man whose charm had finally run out of currency. This was the ultimate ego collapse. Eric's greatest fear was never the loss of love, he didn't have the capacity for it, but the loss of the image of being a loved, successful man of importance. For 5 years, I had been the one translating him to the world. I was the one who explained his arrogance as passion to our friends and his selfishness as focus to our family. I was the bridge between his mediocre reality and the respected persona he wore in public. But once I stopped translating, the truth came out in its raw, ugly form. Without my voice to soften the edges, our social circle saw him for exactly what he was: a man who would leave his fiancée for a vacation while his business was in ruins. I stopped answering the calls from his worried mother and his confused business associates. I let his emails sit in the inbox of a lawyer who would only give him the time of day if he could prove he had the funds to pay for it. The mask didn't just slip. It shattered into 1,000 pieces that he was forced to try and pick up with trembling hands. He was no longer the brilliant entrepreneur or the lucky man about to marry a respected doctor. He was just a middle-aged man standing in a foreign country, clutching a suitcase full of clothes he couldn't afford, with no wife to clean up the mess and no mistress to admire the wreckage. The calls that came through in the middle of the night were no longer furious. They were hollow and broken. He cried into the receiver a sound that would have once broken my heart, but now only elicited a professional sense of pity for a man who had finally met himself in a mirror. He tried to claim that the trip was a momentary lapse in judgment, but I knew better. It was the culmination of 1,000 small choices he had made to prioritize his ego over my humanity. He begged me to come back to fix the bank situation, to tell everyone it was all a big misunderstanding. But as a therapist, I knew that some things are beyond repair, and some people are only sorry when they are caught without a safety net. I listened to him sob for a few moments before I hung up for the final time. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just finished. I had provided the protection he needed to survive, and in his arrogance, he had convinced himself that he didn't need the person who provided it. He had traded a life of substance for a 2-week fantasy, and now he was left with neither. He didn't lose me because of the trip. He lost me because he thought I'd stay. The final severance was as quiet as the falling of a single leaf, devoid of the theatrical screaming matches Eric had likely rehearsed in his head. While he was still navigating the fallout of his European disaster, I had already executed the final phase of my transition. I moved my life into a sun-drenched, smaller home, nestled near the coast, a property I secured, using the inheritance my grandmother had left specifically for my security assets. I had fought tooth and nail to protect from Eric's reach. This new space was filled with things he had once deemed unrefined: My collection of vintage books, overstuffed armchairs, and walls covered in art that didn't have to match his minimalist high-status aesthetic. From this peaceful vantage point, I watched as the natural laws of consequence dismantled the remains of his vanity. Without my financial backing or the social polish I provided, Eric was forced to sell his luxury SUV to settle a fraction of his debts. He moved out of the expansive house we had shared and into a cramped studio apartment on the edge of town, a place that reflected the actual scale of his life when it wasn't inflated by my efforts. My victory didn't lie in the fact that he was struggling. It lay in my utter indifference to his plight. I no longer felt the urge to fix his problems or soften his fall. I simply didn't care, and in the world of a therapist, indifference is the ultimate sign of a successful cure. A month after his return, Eric requested one last meeting, claiming he needed closure. He arrived at a coffee shop near my new office looking frayed, the expensive linen shirts now wrinkled and his bravado replaced by a hollow, practiced humility. He tried to employ the very therapy speak he had once mocked, leaning across the table with a scripted look of vulnerability in his eyes. He told me he was broken, that the trip had been a trauma-induced cry for help, and that he finally realized he had a fear of intimacy that only I could help him navigate. He spoke of his childhood wounds and his need for a healing partner to help him find his way back to the man he was supposed to be. It was a masterful performance, a desperate attempt to pull me back into the role of his emotional caretaker by framing his betrayal as a medical necessity. I sat there sipping my tea and looked at him not as the man I had loved, but as a finished case file. I saw the manipulation behind the moisture in his eyes and the calculated pause in his voice. When he finally stopped talking, expecting me to reach out and offer him a roadmap to redemption, I simply shook my head. I told him that I was no longer interested in the archaeology of his ego. "I'm not your therapist, Eric," I said, my voice calm and final. "And I am certainly not your cure. You are not a project for me to complete. You are a man responsible for his own choices. I hope you find the help you need, but you will have to pay a stranger for it, just like everyone else." That final boundary was the most powerful moment of my life. It was the moment I stopped being a shield and started being a woman. In the months that followed, my new practice began to thrive in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself specializing in helping women of a certain age, women who had spent decades as the invisible support for powerful, selfish men, find their own voices and reclaim their stolen years. My office became a sanctuary for the strategic architects of their own lives, women who realized that their kindness was a gift, not a requirement. I realized that my own journey hadn't been a failure of judgment, but a masterclass in resilience. I learned that true calmness isn't about the absence of conflict. It's about the presence of self-respect. It's about waiting for the right moment to stop explaining and start acting. I am now thriving, vibrant, and entirely free of the weight of a man who viewed my devotion as a commodity. My days are filled with the meaningful work of my own choosing, and my nights are filled with the profound peace of a home where I never have to wonder if I am enough. As I sit on my porch now, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I think about that Tuesday dinner and the man who told me not to be dramatic. I feel a sense of gratitude for his arrogance, because it was the very thing that forced me to see the truth. Eric wanted a world where he could have the security of my love and the thrill of his own selfishness. But he forgot that a bridge only stays up if both sides are anchored in respect. He is still out there somewhere, likely trying to find a new woman to translate his failures into unlucky breaks. But he is no longer my problem to solve. I have successfully processed him, filed him away under lessons learned, and moved on to a life that is entirely my own. The air here is easier to breathe. The silence is a comfort rather than a threat, and the future is a wide-open landscape of my own design. He went to Europe looking for freedom. I stayed home and found mine. Thank you for journeying through Lindsay's transformation from a silent observer to the architect of her own liberation. This story serves as a powerful reminder that our worth is never defined by how much we can endure, but by the courage we find to walk away from what no longer serves us. We want to hear from you now. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stop explaining and start acting to protect your future? Or perhaps you have witnessed someone find their strength in a similar way. Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, as your stories often provide the very inspiration someone else needs to hear today. If this narrative resonated with you and you want to see more stories of resilience, justice, and the quiet power of the high road, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. By joining our community, you ensure that you never miss a moment of these deep, life-affirming journeys. Your support helps us continue to bring these voices to light and foster a space where strength and wisdom are celebrated. Subscribe now and let us know what part of Lindsay's victory touched you the most.